Hello again, and welcome to the second part of the lecture on Universal Design for Learning. So, in this second and last part of our lecture, we will be learning how to identify learning barriers and also look at some ways on how we can use UDL to plan our lessons. Moreover, we will see why UDL is a significant practice in education. So, on to it then. First, what are learning barriers? Could you think of examples of learning barriers? Well, barriers to learning are where students get held up in a lesson or activity. For each student, barriers can differ since we have varied preferences, background, mental ability, and others. We have different levels of skills. We have a different interest. We have different preference on how we should or how we want to learn a concept. Right, so imagine this. You want to go camping. You know you might run into some problems like bad weather, lack of accommodation, flat tires if you're taking your car. You know these barriers, right? And so you anticipate them and you create a plan so you can still get to your destination despite those challenges or barriers. There is no difference in classroom lessons. But with UDL, we can anticipate and address those barriers up front. Here are some examples of common learning barriers. Please read them. First one. Second one. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So, knowing these barriers, let's see how we can prepare for any of it. So I will be showing you questions that will guide you in planning for every part of your lesson using the principles we learned in part 1. And because of that, I hope you can still remember the principles that we learned. Do you? What's the first principle again? The first principle of UDL is multiple means of engagement. Yes. Second principle, multiple means of representation. And how about the third and last principle? Multiple means of action and expression. All right, I hope you can still remember how those principles differ from each other and in how they create UDL as a whole. Okay, so first, when it comes to engagement, ask yourself, how does this lesson design spark students' excitement and curiosity for learning? Again, how does this lesson design spark students' excitement and curiosity for learning? Next question. How does this lesson design tackle potential challenges with focus and determination? How does this lesson design tackle potential challenges with focus and determination? Lastly, how does this lesson design connect the power of students' emotions and motivation in learning? How does this lesson design connect the power of students' emotion in motivation in learning? All right, so these questions for the first principle will help you realize what you need to consider regarding your learner's motivation while preparing your lesson. Okay, so all of those 3 questions pertains to the interest of your students, their motivation to learn your lesson. Furthermore, in terms of representation, here are questions to help you prepare. How are students able to interact with the content in ways that don't depend on a single sense? How are students able to interact with the content in ways that don't depend on a single sense? In other words, how can learners relate to the lesson in more than one method? Or how can learners learn? Okay? How can learners learn the lesson or the information in more than one method? More than one method, that's the point. So what methods or strategies can you use so you can teach that content in more than one strategy, one method? Okay? I think we have been talking about using different strategies ever since in part 1. Another question: how are students able to participate regardless of their background knowledge or facility with language, text, mathematical notation, or symbols? Those are very heavy words. Mathematical notations, symbols. What if they don't know those? Okay, or simply, this question means, how can your students be able to learn the same concepts notwithstanding their prior knowledge and different level of skills in comprehending the lesson? Again, how can your students be able to learn the same concepts notwithstanding or regardless their prior knowledge and different level of skills in comprehending the lesson? All right, I'll give you an example. Maths, solving problems, X, Y, blah, blah. All right. When I was in high school, I wasn't that fond of math because my teacher or our teacher only uses one method. Present the problem, and then she's going to explain the steps on how to solve it. However, I still cannot comprehend it because she's only using one method, explaining the steps. What if, he would have asked others to teach us, like peer teaching, or she could have introduced other methods? Well, I'm sure there are other methods in solving that problem. That's the point of this question. Okay? How can they understand your lesson? Okay, even if they have different levels of skills in comprehending that problem or that lesson. Another question: how are students able to construct meaning and generate new understanding of information? Generate meaning and new understanding. To simplify, how can the learners verbalize the information on their own? And how can they produce a new information out of that understanding? Okay. When I teach a concept to a student or to some students, I am very fond of asking them to explain it in their own words. Okay? I want them to explain it in their own words, and that is my way of letting them construct their own meaning of that concept. I don't like them to repeat what they've read from the book or from the material that was given. No. Okay? All right. I ask them to do that. So I'm more assured that they understood that material, okay, even if they're not reading it. All right. Okay, so how can the learners verbalize to say the information on their own? How can they produce a new information out of that understanding? Okay, so producing new information sometimes means they ask you related questions to that topic. That's one way of producing information. Okay, or they relate experiences or something that they've heard or read from other materials to your lesson. That is producing a new information. Right out. So these questions regarding presentation serves as reminders on how our learners integrate themselves with the information and internalize the concepts we impart them. Moving on. Lastly, on the principle of action and expression. While preparing resources and evaluation activities, ask yourself these questions. How does the lesson have accessible materials and tools for students to interact with? Or can we provide our students appropriate resources? What if we can't? Then your method will be wasted, right? You have the method, you provided them several methods on how they would use the tools and understand the information, but then you cannot provide the proper tools. Okay, another question. How are there multiple ways and tools for students to construct, communicate, and share ideas? How are there multiple ways and tools for students to construct, communicate, and share ideas? Another one. How does the learning environment provide support for students to strategize, plan, and get the most out of the lesson? Lastly, is the classroom or school able to give them the needed support for them to manage their own learning? Okay, for them to strategize, plan, and get the most out of the lesson. Okay, we can see from the questions regarding this last principle that the focus is on materials. Okay, not only with materials but also the end tasks or activities after learning a lesson. So, can we provide them varied materials that will help them understand the content and to learn the needed skills in developing their academic skills? Do you find those questions helpful? I hope so. Now, to summarize, you can remember these 4 steps. First, identify the goal of your lesson. Why do you need to identify your goal? Why do you need to set your goal for your lesson? What's the use of an objective anyway in the lesson or in the lesson plan? Okay, your goal or your objective, objective in a lesson plan will guide you in providing the right strategy or providing the right method or activities in your lesson, all throughout your lesson, right? Okay. Second, determine the barriers that students can encounter in achieving this goal. That's why earlier we had how to determine learning barriers. Okay, how do you determine learning barriers and how should you address it? Okay, so you will not be surprised. Oh wow, my student cannot understand this, but I don't have any other activity to give him or her so he could catch up, right? So it's important to determine the barriers and also to anticipate. Okay, so it's important to observe your classes, observe your students. Third, decide on tools, resources, or strategies you can include in your lesson to help reduce this barrier so that students can achieve the learning goal. All right. After deciding or after anticipating, determining those learning barriers, next now is to think about the tools or the strategies that you can use so that those learning barriers will be lessened. Maybe not entirely eradicated or removed, right? But at least lessened so your students can catch up. Okay, and then we have the last one. Conclude how you can make the strategy available to all students all throughout the lesson. Okay, in part one, we said that, okay, in a UDL classroom, accommodations, right? You remember accommodations? Accommodations should be available for everybody, no matter how minor or severe their challenges are. All right. Okay, I hope it was summarized well with those 4 steps. Now, you might be thinking that knowing the learning barriers and being able to prepare for them will make learning easy for your students, and they might not try hard enough to overcome those difficulties on their own, right? Because it's like you provide them ways on how they can fight those difficulties or those barriers, but not on their own, not independently. Okay, don't worry. Bear in mind that through UDL, we help our students move on to a higher level of understanding. Okay? We help them. As they build expertise on the process, the more independent they could be in facilitating their own learning. Okay, so right now you're just helping them. But if you think they can do it on their own, they know how to handle their weaknesses, or if they have learning barriers, they know how, okay, or they they can independently decide on how to tackle that problem, then you can let them. Hope that's clear. Are you still with me? Good. Let's learn more about UDL. So after knowing some guide questions that will help you with any barriers, time to put into action by planning your lesson. So how should we or you do that? Well, planning a lesson while minding students' needs could be a daunting task, could be very scary, since you consider several differences and differences to address, right? So here we have 3 key steps: plan, implement, and evaluate. Plan, implement, and evaluate. Okay? And some guidelines under these steps. Let's see. Step 1, proactively design. Proactively design. What does proactively mean? Pro, active, professional, active. Proactively meaning taking action before something happens. That is, anticipating and planning for possible challenges along the way. So what should we do? What should we do? Do you have an answer for me? Okay. Analyze the lesson goal. Why? On goal again, lesson goal again. Why is this thing very important? Because you need to know the focus of your lesson. Your lesson goal is the focus. And as I said earlier, your lesson goal or objectives will help you determine which strategies you should use. Okay, and how you should go about your lesson. Okay. Second, anticipate student Variability. Another word, variability. What does variability mean? Let's learn some vocabularies. Variability. You can use your dictionaries, translators, if you can find the meaning to variability. Okay, so variability means inconsistency or irregularity on things regarding your students, like their behavior, background knowledge, activity preferences, and the like. Also have personality. Okay, those are examples of variability or inconsistency. All right, we should anticipate those. Okay, last one. Okay, add predetermined strategies to reduce anticipated barriers. Add predetermined strategies to reduce barriers. Okay, predetermined means you already thought of those strategies beforehand. Okay, predetermined. Pre means before. Okay, before determined, before thought of. Okay. Next step. Okay, we are done with the first step, that is proactively design or plan. Okay, design means to plan. The next step, as I mentioned earlier, is to implement. Okay, the next step is to implement or facilitate. Okay, implement, facilitate, to do, put it into action. And also observe. While implementing, you should also observe. So after planning, it's time to put it into action. So during the lesson, do this. Observe how students are or aren't using the options. Okay, so you've thought of the learning barriers and you've thought of the strategies that you can use to reduce those barriers, right? But, okay, you also need to observe, are the students using it or aren't using it? Okay, you should observe that. Next, work with students to develop a deeper understanding of what they need or don't need to achieve the goal. You need to be there to assist your learners throughout your lessons and the process. Okay? You need to be there to assist your learners until the end, from beginning to end of the process or the lesson. Okay? So that you can also explain them some things or some process. Why do they need to do that or not? The last step is offer process-based feedback to students as they are working. Process-based, not result-based. Okay? In the first part, I mentioned already the importance of appreciating your students' effort, right? So, in addition to that, this step reminds us to be on the lookout on how students react to our prepared plan and see to it that they are given necessary criticism. Okay, and you should focus on the process. The last step would be to reflect and redesign. Is reflecting useful for you as the teacher? Is reflecting useful? Absolutely, right? You cannot be perfectly sure that everything will be flawless, although you prepared for it, considering the needed factors, variability, goals, learning barriers. Okay? You cannot be sure that everything will be perfect even if you planned for those things. All right, so here are some questions to ask yourself after your lesson. 1. Was the goal meaningful and challenging? Okay. Was the goal meaningful and challenging? Why is it important to assess your goal again? Here we are with goal again. Rating the accomplishment of your goal determines if your lesson and methods were a success or not. Okay? And if your students were able to learn something following that goal or not. Okay. Right. Is it meaningful? Is your goal meaningful? Did they learn something worth it from that lesson? Okay. Was it challenging enough? Okay. Too easy is not good. Easy is not good. Too difficult is also not good. 2. Were there flexible options available for engagement, representation, and action and expression that students could choose? Have you given your learners enough variety of resources and methods to choose from? Variety. 3rd, where were students still stuck or frustrated? So how was the flow of the lesson? Are there any setbacks? Okay. Were there any activities you've prepared that was too difficult for them to overcome? Do you need to reteach some parts? Or maybe the whole of your lesson? That would be terrible. But if you need to do it, you need to. Okay. So you need to analyze which part, which part were they stuck? Or which part seems to frustrate them, which they cannot learn that well. Okay, and lastly, can you identify 1 or 2 new ideas you could integrate into the design of the lesson next time? This is important. Have you realized any method or strategies you could mix in for your upcoming lessons? Perhaps you saw new learning barriers that you need to address next time. Okay. So in this final step, we are encouraged to reevaluate on our methods and on our lesson as a whole. And perhaps see if you have discovered things you can improve on. There you go. So the 3 steps when planning. Let's review. Step 1 is plan or design your lesson in consideration of goals and variability. Step 2, implement or do it. Put it into action. While you put your plan into action, observe on how students respond to it. Okay? How do they respond to the strategies? Were they happy that they were given several choices? Okay? Or do they prefer just one method? Lastly, evaluate. So after implementing, reflect on your methods and see if you had achieved your learning goal or learning goals. Okay, we are now nearing the end of our lecture, and thank you for being with me still. Are you? I hope you're still awake. And since we're nearing the end, we will try to see why we need to implement this technique. Okay, let's see the importance. Have you thought of the good side of this approach yourself while you were listening or watching this lecture? Yes? No? What have you liked so far in this approach? What was interesting? Okay. Well, among your answers, among your observations, here are some benefits to UDL. First, or 1, it helps you anticipate and plan for all your learners. The principle of UDL is to provide for all types of learners, right? That's why you prepare different strategies, right? Second, it can help you make sure the greatest range of students can access and engage in learning. Due to the variety that you provide for them, your students have equal chances to learning. Third, it gives you framework to follow so you can reduce barriers. Following the principles and guidelines, you can be assured that you are giving your learners equal shot to education. Equal shot to education. Okay? And lastly, it helps you prepare a learning environment where students have what they need to flexibly meet learning goals. And so, because of these reasons, this approach to learning is a good way to nurture learners who are purposeful and motivated. They're purposeful and motivated because you allowed them to be involved and be guided in the process. Resourceful and knowledgeable, since you provide them varied tasks to work on, right? Lastly, strategic and goal-directed, for the reason that you have given them freedom. You have given them freedom to decide on how their learning would go. Okay. Now remember this. Individuals bring a huge variety of skills, needs, and interests to learning. Difference in learning are going to be constant in education. Cannot remove that. We cannot make our students uniform with skills and ability and everything. Therefore, UDL helps each student create an ideal curriculum that will accommodate diverse learning needs of all students. All right, so we're finally done for this lesson in UDL. We were able to tackle this list of topics, and I hope you were able to follow through all of it with me. That's it. Thank you, and happy teaching.